U.S. President Barack Obama makes a historic trip to Cuba. Somalia is trying to recover from years as a failed state, but it continues to be dogged by the presence of al-Shabaab. And a streaming giant and song publishers reach a multi-million-dollar royalty agreement. And that could be very good news for artists. Africa 54 starts right now.
Good evening and welcome. I'm Vincent Makori. This is Africa 54. U.S. President Barack Obama is spending the first full day of his trip to Cuba in talks with Cuban President Raul Castro in their effort to close the book on more than 5 decades of hostility. Mr. Obama's history-making visit to the communist nation would have been unthinkable before last year. As VOA's Michael Bowman reports, the trip is being closely watched around the world.
An instantly iconic moment. Barack Obama became the first sitting U.S. president to visit Cuba in nearly 90 years. Palpable excitement in Havana.
A historic day. Many years since a U.S. president came to Cuba.
I think there will be many positive changes, improvements for Cuba's economy, tourism, and the ability to enter and leave the country.
Obama will meet with ordinary Cubans, catch an exhibition baseball game, and address the Cuban people in a televised speech.
He's highly popular in the country, and people will be listening very closely to what he has to say.
James Kaysen headed the U.S. interest section in Havana during the George W. Bush administration.
He needs to be able to speak to the Cuban people, calling for free elections, calling for a more liberal economic system which will bring prosperity.
The White House says Obama will speak out.
And he is going to sit down with the leader of Cuba and say, you need to do a better job of protecting the human rights of your people.
In our relations with the United States, there can be no negotiations on internal changes in Cuba that are and will remain strictly a sovereign matter for our people.
The Cuban government has its own agenda.
If the U.S. government really wants to help the people of Cuba like it says, then it has to lift the embargo.
The decades-old U.S. economic embargo is one thing Obama cannot end by himself.
Our trade embargo on Castro's Cuba, passed by Congress in 1959, is still, in fact, intact and enforceable. Despite the president's attempt to undermine this embargo by executive action, he is ultimately bound by it. That is the law of the land.
Beyond the rich symbolism, observers differ on the trip's ultimate impact.
It is the definitive turning of the page away from the Cold War and policies of isolation and hostilities and embargoes toward a new era of engagement, constructive engagement.
My view is that no policy will work while the Castros are alive. I've always said the only solution is the biological solution. When they're dead.
Obama is to meet with President Raul Castro, not former leader Fidel Castro. No one doubts the trip is solidifying America's opening with Cuba, but where that leads, no one can say for sure. Michael Bowman, VOA News, Washington.
Well, for more on President Obama's landmark 3-day trip to Cuba, let's go live to Havana, where VOA's Natasha Mazgovaya is standing by. Hello, Natasha.
Hello.
Now,
great to be with you.
Thank you. Now, we know that the two leaders, President Obama and Raul Castro, had meetings today. Can you tell us what was discussed, if at all you know?
Well, first of all, I must say that it was a very exciting moment to hear American anthem playing in Havana at Palacio de Revolución, at the Palace of Revolution, where the two leaders are meeting. Actually, it's their first meeting since President Obama landed yesterday. So they met for the first time today. It's their third meeting. In total, there was a handshake. The two leaders reviewed the troops. They're expected to review all the difficult issues that still remain remain between the countries and are not so easy to solve. The political problems, the issue of the human rights, because we saw actually in the days and even hours leading to Obama's visit, dissidents arrested, and some of them, if I understand correctly, are still detained, and some dissidents were intended to protest even now when this meeting is going on. It is supposed to last about 2 hours. Then we are expected to hear some public statements. Again, until the last moment, it wasn't clear if there will be some open press conference with the two leaders, which is a common thing for President Obama's foreign visits. And how far this visit will take the Cuban-American relations is still remains to be seen. But when we talk to ordinary Cubans in the streets, so it's very clear that they want this embargo to be over.
Natasha, well, they want the embargo to be over, but from what you're hearing, do they look forward to any changes just because the president has visited? Do they feel like things are going to change?
Well, some changes we are already seeing. It's far from this cultural and political revolution, basically, that some people are hoping to see. But we started seeing a couple of years ago already that the internet started coming to Cuba, not to the houses yet, but to some hotspots that in the parks, for example, that people are gathering around and getting some information. And internet, it also means business. And business, by the way, is a big another big topic on the agenda for President Obama, because after the meeting with President Raul Castro, he's going to meet with a group of entrepreneurs. This private sector is growing in Cuba in the past few years. These reforms actually were started slowly, even before this thaw in relationship between the two countries, and maybe it will get now accelerated. It will get some push. America, just before President Obama's visit, facilitated and eased some of the sanctions that might ease the transactions between the countries, their transactions in dollars. So basically, there is a big issue on the agenda, and we will see how it goes on from here.
Indeed, Natasha. Thank you very much. That's viewers Natasha Moscovaya reporting live from Havana, Cuba. Well, across Africa, millions of voters went to the polls over the weekend to elect presidents, members of parliament, and in the case of Senegal, vote on a referendum to determine the length of a presidential term. In Benin, Prime Minister Lionel Sinzo conceded defeat to businessman Patrice Talon in a second-round runoff presidential vote after neither won an outright majority in the first round of voting on March the 6th. Sinzo, a former economist and investment banker, backed by outgoing President Thomas Boni Yayi and the main opposition Democratic Renewal Party, was an early front-runner in the election after winning the first round of voting. President-elect Patrice Talon is a well-known entrepreneur who made his money in the key sector of cotton and running Cotonou's port. He is one of the most powerful figures in Beninese business. In 2012, he was accused of being the brains behind a bizarre alleged plot to poison the president, then the following year of attempting to endanger the security of the state. At the time, Talon was being prosecuted in several embezzlement cases and fled the country. Boni Yayi pardoned him in May 2014, paving the way for his return and his run for the presidency. Voters in Niger cast ballots in the country's first ever presidential runoff Sunday, with incumbent Mahamadou Issoufou on track for a second term as the opposition observed a boycott. The 64-year-old Issoufou, a former mining engineer, was facing his main challenger, jailed opposition leader Hama Amadou, 66. Amadou had been forced to campaign from behind bars after being detained on November 14th on baby trafficking charges that he says are bogus and were aimed at keeping out of the race. Just days before the vote, he was evacuated from prison and flown to Paris for medical treatment, with the government saying he was suffering from an unspecified chronic ailment. Issoufou, who is running for a second time in office, took a solid lead with 48.4% in the initial vote on February 21st, way ahead of Amadou, who scored 17.7%. During the campaign, Issoufou, who took office in 2011, repeatedly pledged to bring peace and prosperity to the desolate but uranium-rich country.
5 ans, un seul mandat.
5 years, a single term, is not enough to overcome challenges, in particular the security challenges. Do not forget that a few days ago we were the victim of a double attack.
In the Republic of Congo, Sunday's voting was held under immediate blackout. The government says it ordered mobile phone and internet services cut for the day across the oil-producing Central African country for reasons of security and public tranquility. It also banned motor vehicle use nationwide. Despite protests in which at least 18 demonstrators died, Sassou Nguesso pushed through constitutional changes in October to remove term and age limits that would have prevented him from standing again. The government rejected opposition accusations it was preparing to cheat, claiming its opponents were laying the groundwork for post-election chaos. In East Africa, the ruling party candidate in Tanzania's semi-autonomous Zanzibar was declared the winner in Sunday's rerun of presidential elections, boycotted by the opposition. The incumbent Zanzibar President Ali Mohamed Shein of the national ruling CCM party won 91.4% of the votes in Sunday's ballot. In October, the Zanzibar Electoral Commission called for a rerun, citing fraud, a charge the opposition says was made up. Opposition CAF leader Saif Sharif Hamadi has lost 4 previous elections since 1995 by narrow margins. In Senegal, turnout was low for Sunday's controversial referendum on sweeping constitutional reforms, which include cutting the presidential term from 7 to 5 years. Political opponents call on people to vote no in protest against President Macky Sall. Many say he has failed to deliver on his campaign promises, including creating jobs for the young, boosting the economy, and rooting out corruption. Well, Somalia is trying to recover from years as a failed state when it was effectively ungovernable. The process of normalization is being hampered, however, by the continued presence of Al-Shabaab, an Islamist extremist group that is resisting the efforts of the government and a Western-backed African Union force to stabilize the region. VOA senior investigative analyst Jeffrey Young reports on the status of Al-Shabaab's attempt to dominate the Horn of Africa nation.
Somalia, at the tip of the Horn of Africa, is a hotbed of Islamist insurrection. Driving that is the terrorist group Harakat al-Shabaab al-Mujahideen, commonly called al-Shabaab, that carries out acts of terror, along with an armed struggle to overthrow the internationally recognized government in Mogadishu. Al-Shabaab, which means the Mujahideen youth movement, imposes its version of strict Salafist Islam on areas under its control. But, as RAND Corporation terrorism analyst Colin Clark notes, Al-Shabaab is not as extreme as another terrorist group, Daesh, also known as the Islamic State.
The ideology of Islamist terrorism exists on a spectrum. And if Daesh is at the one extreme end, I'd say Shabaab is probably more toward the middle, if not toward the lighter end. So whether or not this group really believes in Sharia is debatable. But they will use that, implement it to gain the resources necessary to control the territory that they're seeking to occupy.
Terror groups need money to fund their attacks and pay fighters. Daesh funds itself through the oil-producing lands it controls. But Somalia has virtually no oil. Tom Keating at the Royal United Services Institute in London says Al-Shabaab has found another way to generate revenue.
Its finances gained in terrific strength as it took territory and was able to tax individuals and businesses who operated in the territory that it controlled as it developed a quasi-governmental role. No access to oil, but an important commodity in the territory that it controls is excellent acacia wood for producing charcoal. And the demand for charcoal in Gulf states across the ocean from Somalia is very strong. And that's an industry that they have historically tapped into very effectively to raise money for their operations.
Analysts Keating and Clark both say Al-Shabaab is not significantly involved in another big money earner that has recently plagued the waters off Somalia's coast, piracy. That, they say, was the work of other smaller operators. And thanks to stepped-up international naval patrols and interdictions, piracy has lately become far less of a problem. In addition to its attacks against Somali government and African Union forces, Al-Shabaab has staged a series of high-visibility terrorist operations. The most spectacular took place in Nairobi, Kenya in September 2013. There, Al-Shabaab killed 67 people at the upscale Westgate Mall in a siege that lasted several days. They've also conducted operations in Djibouti and Uganda. And in February, they claimed responsibility for an unsuccessful attempt by a suicide bomber to bring down an airliner in flight. Shortly after the Nairobi Mall attack, U.S. Undersecretary of State for Africa Linda Thomas-Greenfield testified before Congress that while the United States is not engaged in on-the-ground combat in Somalia, U.S. forces are working closely with the African Union force called AMISOM. She praised AMISOM's effectiveness.
The successes of the African Union mission in Somalia, AMISOM troop contributing countries, and strategic partners to combat and eviscerate al-Shabaab are demonstrating the strength of an African-led model. Nonetheless, this Somalia-based al-Qaeda affiliate remains a dangerous presence.
Among the most recent U.S. attacks against al-Shabaab was an airstrike in early March against a training camp. It killed an estimated 150 fighters. The Pentagon's main focus, however, is to strengthen AMISOM, so its troops, most of them from East African nations, can finish off al-Shabaab. U.S. Army trainer Sergeant Lucas Velmer says AMISOM's success would give Somali President Hassan Sheikh Mohamud and his 4-year-old government breathing room to win over the Somali people.
What we're trying to do is, by conducting this training with the different troop contributing countries to AMISOM, is bring the population to the side of AMISOM and ultimately the Somali government.
At the same time, Undersecretary of State Greenfield makes it clear that the Somali government must behave responsibly and credibly to win the people's respect and ultimately to suppress al-Shabaab.
Al-Shabaab must be stopped. The federal government of Somalia must increase its capacity to counter al-Shabaab, unify a fractured political system, and provide basic services to the Somali people.
RUSI analyst Tom Keating and RAND's Colin Clark are among the experts who say that with al-Shabaab, as with many other terrorist groups, the way to beat them is a combination of good governance and economic development that makes radicalism less attractive, along with a robust effort to eliminate terrorists wherever they stand.
Well, joining me in the studio for a little more insight on al-Shabaab is Jeffrey Young, VOA's senior investigative analyst. Welcome, Jeff. Now, the big question always has been the extent to which the U.S. would be willing to involve itself in Somalia, the Horn of Africa.
The United States is actually very involved in this project, but it's not boots on the ground. There are not U.S. forces fighting alongside AMISOM. However, as you saw in this report, we, the United States, are training AMISOM forces. We're also providing intelligence. So if you need to put AMISOM in the right place to engage and defeat al-Shabaab, we're able to give them the intel that we get from satellites and other sources to say, this is where you go, this is what you're going to encounter, and here's an opportunity to attack and defeat.
There's a sense in which it looks like actually al-Shabaab has been retreating in as much as it has made these frequent attacks, right?
Al-Shabaab is not strong enough militarily to take on UNISOM, or AMISOM rather. It's simply not a big constituted army. It's guerrillas. They fight asymmetrically. That's why there's been so many bombings, such as the bus attack in Kenya, such as what you saw at Westgate Mall. This is what they can fight with, asymmetric warfare. Their ability to stand face-to-face against any constituted military is very limited.
Well, thank you so much for excellent reporting.
Thank you.
Well, Jeffrey Young, a VOA's senior investigative analyst. We want to know what you think about Africa 54 and the stories we cover. Join the conversation on Facebook. The address is Africa 54. Then check out our headlines 24/7 on voaafrica.com. Find me on Twitter at VOA Vince Makori. Well, coming up, Africa 54 business correspondent Jill Malandrino speaks with an expert on the recent rise of U.S. stocks. Stay with us.
This is BizBeat.
Diving for pearls, a dangerous profession, and one that for hundreds of years was the main industry for Gulf states. Today, it's oil, but there's a movement to preserve the heritage and to restore the pearl industry in Muharraq, once the diving center of the past. Noor Al-Saya of UNESCO.
So the idea behind the whole project is also to make pearling a sustainable economy for Bahrain once again.
The discovery of oil and Japan's entrance into the pearl market in 1930 killed the Arabian industry. Today, by protecting offshore oyster beds, Noor Al-Saya says an old tradition can be maintained.
The diving is going to be regulated there in order to sustain sustainable fishing and pearl diving activity.
The area's museums are luring tourists who now understand how important the pearl industry used to be. And by restoring old pearl houses of yesterday, a new foundation is set to bring back a once-dead pearl economy. For VOA's BizBeat, I'm Philip Alexio.
Welcome back. In business news, the upward momentum has been unstoppable in U.S. stocks since the February 11th low in the Standard & Poor's 500. Africa 54 business correspondent Jim Malandrino in New York met with Bob Lang of Explosive Options for his take on how much longer it may continue.
The S&P 500 has rallied over 250 points for 5 weeks of gains. Bob, what happened from the February 11th low where everybody was selling, now everybody wants to buy?
It's been an amazing run, hasn't it,
yes,
Jill?
It
and I think when we look at the divergence between interest rates and the stock market, we can kind of get a feel as to why this turned. And what we talked about earlier was that when interest rates get to a certain level on the low side, I think it went to about 1.5% on the 10-year yield, hedge fund managers, big fund money managers decide that they're not going to get as good a return on fixed income as they would in equity. So we see a light, it's almost like a light switch goes off, right? You hit the light switch and we all of a sudden go from risk off to risk on. And I think that's what happened. We've had these sort of rallies happen 3 times in the last year and a half. October 2014, we ripped 220 handles on the upside on the S&P 500. We ripped over 200 points on the S&P 500 last October when we bottomed in September. It looked like we were going to be heading down to death. So that's the sort of thing that we get a shift from risk off to risk on.
Now, you brought up low interest rates. It's been interesting because with this 5-week rally, the financials really participated because we did not see that for the end of 2015, the beginning of 2016. Now, for banks to grow and increase their earnings, they need higher interest rates. Why do you think they're performing this well in an environment that is negative for them?
Well, I think that that's just one component of the earnings for banks. You talk about net interest margin, or NIM, which is the difference between what they're paying and what they're borrowing at. So, yes, that works very well for banks when the yield curve is steep. We don't have a real steep yield curve right now. We have Fed funds rate essentially at 0. Well, it's a quarter basis point, right? And we have long-term rates at 1.5% to 3% where they were. Now they're stepped up a little bit to 2.5% to 3.5%. That's still not a very big margin between what they're borrowing at and what they're paying. Right. So I think that if that yield curve starts to steepen, the only way you're going to do that is if you get A, more inflation, or B, more growth in the economy.
Right. And finally, are you buying here? Do you think it's time to step back a bit, or are you observing market action at this point?
Well, I'm a trend guy, so I like to try. I don't like to try to find the tops. I don't try to find the bottoms. But I do, to a man, believe that this rally is probably gone a little bit too far. So to answer your question, I'm not adding a lot of new stuff. I'm being very selective. I'm just trying to find the right stuff that's going to play for me. I'm taking profits as I've been moving along. And look, you know what? There's the way this market reacts. We're going to have some big whacks coming in from the market. So it just happens. And I don't really want to be there. Give back some of the gains that we've had over the past few weeks.
Okay. Thank you very much, Bob.
Thank you, Jill.
Well, it's time now for a short break. Still to come on Africa 54. Is a new agreement over unpaid song royalties a turning point for recording artists? We'll be right back. Welcome back to Africa 54. Here's what's trending. An agreement over royalties reached between Spotify and the National Music Publishers Association is being called a win for both songwriters and the music streaming service. Now, the parties announced the agreement last week, saying it would allow independent and major publishers to receive royalties for songs on Spotify, where ownership information of the songs was not previously known. Billboard reported that the settlement would total around $30 million. Association members will have 3 months to opt into the agreement. U.S. music consumers almost doubled their use of streaming services in 2015, with Apple's new Apple Music platform helping boost volume a record 93%, according to Nielsen Music in January. Well, next up, Swiss watchmakers once dismissed smartwatches as short-lived gadgets. Not anymore. Shipments of smartwatches overtook traditional watches in the final quarter of 2015. Now, Switzerland's world-famous watchmaking industry has started to look seriously into the potential for luxury smartwatches. The race is on to grab a chunk of market expected to grow from $1.3 billion in 2014 to $117 billion in 2020. The latest figures show sales of luxury Swiss watches slid by a little over 3% in 2015, following 5 years of growth. And the biggest fall was in China, where Swiss luxury watch sales were down more than 20%. Well, and finally, the traditional staple of a Western diet is being reinvented by researchers at a Polish university, looking for recipes to make bread more than just a standard foodstuff. Researchers are testing different ingredients believed to provide protection against diseases like diabetes and cancer. This is done through adding various ingredients to dough in such a way that preserves their value in the baking process while keeping the original flavor of the bread. Dried fruit and herbs are added not for the taste, but solely for their long-term disease prevention properties. Different methods of preparing the dough and baking bread were tested in the study, as well as ingredients such as apples, cocoa extract, coconut, onion, red cabbage, and many kinds of seeds and grains such as oats and flax. And that is what is trending today. And that's our show. Have a good night.
Welcome to English in a Minute. This American idiom is about getting your facts right.
Did you hear that rumor going around about Craig and Cheryl calling off their wedding?
Yeah, I heard it straight from the horse's mouth. Craig told me he's calling off the wedding. I didn't want to ask too many questions, but it's true.
Do people really look into a horse's mouth for facts? Straight from the horse's mouth means you got information about a situation directly from a person involved, and not through rumors. The saying comes from the fact that people can tell the true age of a horse by looking at the teeth in its mouth. So, if you get your information straight from the horse's mouth, you have the truth. And that's English in a Minute.